Hi everyone and welcome to this evening's session. My name is Laura Mondon. I'm one of the trainers here at the Institute of Community Directors Australia, and I'd like to start today's session by inviting you to join me in acknowledging First Peoples and their connection to country. In Australia's connection has been maintained for more than 60,000 years, exists today and extends into the future. Together we acknowledge the elders and ancestors of country on which we live and work, we pay our respects, and we recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to lands and waters of Australia. This session, Attracting and Retaining Volunteers, is the third session in a series of 5 one-hour sessions on topics supporting you in your role as committee members. Thank you for your attendance and welcome. This session will be recorded and will be shared with anyone who is registered to attend the sessions. I'd also at this point like to acknowledge Mitch and Nicole from Smart Transformation who have made these sessions possible. Okay, just a couple of things I'd like to cover before we get started. I'd first of all like to introduce you to Grace, who'll be around to help us this evening with any technical difficulties we might be having. Just pointing out a couple of things that will help you participate in this evening's session. The control panel is at the top right-hand corner of your screen. While you won't be able to speak with me this evening, you can ask questions through the chat box by typing your question, and I'll respond or vocalise the answer. If I don't know the answer on the spot, then I'll take that on notice and respond to you in the next couple of days. Remember, you can also download the presentation, so you don't need to take any notes this evening if you don't wish to. And just a reminder again that it will be recorded and you'll get a link to the recording so you can re-watch anything that you'd like to look at again later on. Just another couple of things in case you're having any issues with your audio. If you can have a look at the control panel, and as you can see there, you can select to turn on the audio and select where the audio is coming from. Like I said though, if you're having any difficulties, please do just put a message in the chat and I'll be able to assist you hopefully. Another one there, again, that's where the chat box is, so you can ask questions. Hopefully everybody's found everything. Wonderful. We'll move on. Okay, so now that we've got the technical side of things sorted, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're covering at this evening's session. As I'm sure you all know very well, community organisations depend on volunteers to keep them going. From volunteer committee members like yourselves leading the organisations, right through to those helping run events, community events. Today we're going to talk a bit about volunteers with an awareness, of course, that you are volunteers yourself, so you're very clear on the reasons people do volunteer and what motivates them to contribute to the community in this way. Of course, it's that sense of community that drives much of the volunteer work that we see. And so today's about exploring some of the tools, resources and knowledge that you might utilise to help ensure your existing and future relationships with your volunteers. So we'll look a bit, give a bit of background about the changing face of volunteering. Then we'll also look at how your organisation can get ready for volunteers. You may already have them in place, but this might be about recruiting a new tranche of volunteers. You're probably doing some of those things already, but we'll just cover off some of the basics this evening. I'll also talk about how you might approach recruiting new volunteers to your organisation, and then we'll spend a bit of time at the end looking at how to manage and maintain our volunteers in terms of keeping them connected to your organisation. Pardon me. So our community is an organisation that supports not-for-profit organisations, and it's the one I work for. The Institute of Community Directors is part of that organisation. And our community did a study on the impact of COVID-19 for not-for-profits, and it showed, unsurprisingly, that volunteering was hit very hard by the pandemic. Our community surveyed 907 not-for-profit representatives and 1,027 members of the public to examine the impact that the pandemic had on the sector and what it needed to recover. So you can click on the link there if you're interested in looking at more of the survey results. So we know, of course, I've already said it, but it's also, I guess, it's been talked about in the media. We know the pandemic has hit hard in many areas, and volunteering has been one of those areas. And we know our volunteers are our most precious resource, so we've got to support, cultivate the relationship with them so that we can keep them happy and they can keep doing the fantastic work that they do for us. The not-for-profit sector represents 7% of the Australian economy. So without volunteers, the country essentially does stop because we rely on them so heavily. And Australia's always been a place where we could count on people to pitch in times of need. We volunteered for various causes at an impressive rate, which is really positive. For example, 51% of Australia's 56,000 charities rely wholly on volunteers, so they don't actually have any paid staff. So it's an amazing contribution that volunteers make to those organisations. And while we know volunteering has changed because of the pandemic, I'd like to explore a little bit about what that has meant in the next slide. So let's try and look at some of the issues and background that give us the understanding around the changing volunteer landscape. At the peak of volunteering in Australia in 2010, the Bureau of Statistics General Social Survey showed that 36%, that's over a third of the population, had joined up as volunteers. So that compares with the US and the UK, where the figures are 22% and 25% respectively. Unfortunately, since 2010, we've seen a continuous decline in that. So this is actually prior to the pandemic. There were already trends that are a downward turn in terms of the amount of people that were volunteering. So by the time we got to 2019, it seems like a long time ago now, pre-pandemic, the figures had already dropped to 29%. So the sector was already seeing a huge impact in the decline of volunteers. In our community's April 2020 COVID-19 Community Sector Impact Survey, 58% of not-for-profits said that the labour that they relied on, the volunteer labour, had experienced a huge drop in numbers. And in 2020, that was 43%. So it's a significant number. It's two significant numbers. By 2021, however, the figures were even more compounded, with 64% of respondents saying that they'd had a drop. However, there is a glimmer and a glimpse of good news in that the latest survey showed only 34% reporting that they had experienced a significant decrease. So it is indicating that some volunteers are returning post-pandemic, and we hope that that obviously continues to rise as we move further and further out of the critical pandemic phase. So although overall a large majority, 81% of 2021 respondents said the pandemic had affected their ability to manage and recruit volunteers, so it's still having a huge impact. So that's the recent history, and the reason I'm saying this is to give a bit of a scene setting for where we're at across the country in terms of volunteering. So finding a way forward. So volunteering has changed. So what can you do to bring volunteers back to your organisation in this sort of post-pandemic world? One thing you can try to do is to make sure your organisation is prepared for volunteers. And we're going to cover that in the next few slides. You could also start looking at what volunteers want out of volunteering. Your organisation might need to consider whether the tasks that volunteers were once prepared to do is still the case. Are people still happy to come along and do those particular tasks, or are they actually interested in other areas? The Bureau of Statistics recently asked people why they'd stopped volunteering, and for about 25%, it was purely COVID. So it was exposure, it was risk, and those people may come back. 30%, however, said they couldn't fit volunteering around their work commitments, and 22% said they couldn't fit it around their family commitments, and there was 3% that couldn't afford volunteering. So while the pandemic still had a huge impact in those numbers, and we know it contributed significantly to the decrease, some of the trends were already there. So people are busier, their lives are busier, their family commitments are greater, and that is having an impact on their capacity to step in and volunteer. So of course, what we need to do somewhat is actually find out, well, what do the volunteers want? What can we do to bring them on board and to attract them? So in tonight's presentation, we'll look a little bit at what motivates people to volunteer. And this doesn't just apply to young people and new volunteers, it's people in general who are volunteering. So people value flexibility. So they want to be able to contribute around their own needs. So we've already talked about the fact that people have increasing family responsibilities. They might be working longer hours. So they want a volunteering opportunity that's going to allow them to continue to meet their other commitments. They're also engaged in short, personalised, more bite-sized opportunities. And this doesn't mean every volunteer wants that, but this is some of the trends that we're seeing in our work here at ICTA. They also might, you might have to articulate what's in it for them. So the volunteers themselves are no longer just turning up saying, hey, I'm happy to do anything. They might actually want to know, well, what's in it for me? What can I get out of this? And we will talk about that in a little bit. They also want to be able to use their brains as well as their brawn. So an opportunity to contribute their skills. They might have a particular set of skills in their professional life that they want to actually apply to a volunteering situation. So I guess that's something to think about as well in terms of the kinds of jobs and tasks that you might allocate to a volunteer. So essentially it means rethinking the approach that you might have applied in the past into this new world of volunteering. Now in this next section, we're going to look at some of the things that you should consider when you're preparing for your volunteers. So again, I mentioned earlier, you might already have some of this in place, but it's worth mentioning again for those who haven't, who are perhaps starting out volunteering or who maybe are rethinking how they approach volunteering. So we're going to cover a little bit about the rights of volunteers, insurance considerations, job descriptions, and job analysis. So volunteers, you may be aware, are not covered by awards and workplace agreements like paid staff, but they still do have rights while they're volunteering with you. If you have these front of mind at the outset, you can set yourself up to develop positive volunteer relationships that are beneficial for everyone. Volunteering Australia, their link is on the PowerPoint slide that you see there, has some really great resources that look at this, and they've actually got a checklist, which is, there's a very tiny little picture there of the checklist itself, but you can download the full checklist by using the link. So I'm not going to read out the whole list, but essentially some of the things that volunteers have a right to have is a health and safe work environment. Everybody has that right, and volunteers are included. They have a right to be covered by adequate insurance, and we will talk a little bit about insurance in a moment. They have a right to be reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses, and we will talk about what some of those might be. They have a right to have a job description that gives them clear guidance on what's expected of them and expected hours of work. They also have a right to be oriented appropriately and inducted into your organisation. So they know who's who, they know where all the amenities are, and they're made to feel welcome. That's a really important part of starting a new volunteer at your organisation. And they should also be provided with sufficient training so that they can do their job properly. So we're thinking about your current volunteers. Can you provide them with a safe place of work? Have you provided them with the proper induction? It's never too late to go back and do that, even if some parts of the induction process might have been missed because it wasn't the right time or a lot was happening. It's not too late to go back and say, hey, I don't know if we covered this off in the first few weeks or few months, but we're going to do a new induction process, so we'd like to test it out on you. Could be one opportunity. So one of the things that was listed on the checklist that I mentioned earlier is insurance for volunteers. So I've put a few links on there that I think would be valuable for you to take a look at. Essentially, you have to check that it's essential to check what coverage you have for your volunteers, and you have to obtain your own insurance policy. So this information will be provided to you by your insurer. If you're unsure, you would ring up and ask them for details on the policy and what level of coverage. So it's really important that you have access to that document. As the committee and the governing body of the organisation, you're responsible for making sure that that adequate insurance is in place. And you also want to understand what exclusions are, so that can be perhaps explained to the volunteer as well. And just as a side note here, it's good practice for the organisation to know exactly who is volunteering for you at any one time. So having a list of all your volunteers and perhaps a sign-in sheet or whatever process you put in place so that you know who's there at any one time is really important for good governance and good management of your volunteers, and also having information about an emergency contact just in case something does happen is some of the same stuff that you would do for your staff, you would absolutely do for your volunteers as well. Because they are, while they're unpaid, they still are working for you. They're undertaking responsibilities. So the last two links on the page relate to general types of insurance that also might be worth taking a look at. Directors' liability insurance covers volunteer boards and is definitely something you want to have in place. So it's worth having a look at. Public liability insurance, what the exclusions are, how much you're covered for, building insurance, etc. Obviously, there's insurance for just about everything, but one of those links actually gives you a bit of a list of some of the things as a not-for-profit that you should be considering insuring. Now, a volunteer coordinator is something, given the complexity we've already described. I mean, volunteering doesn't always have to be complicated, but it is a real thing. So it is important to put in place some structure around the role. So it might be worth considering putting in place a volunteer coordinator that can help coordinate volunteers, but also help manage them, induct them into your organisation. That's particularly important perhaps if you have more than one volunteer or you have a big pool of volunteers, so that you've got somebody who has that knowledge. It could be a committee member, it could be a staff member who's allocated that responsibility, and just depending on the size of the organisation. And like the slide says, the coordinator can oversee the development of job descriptions, help advertise roles, help induct and train volunteers, and also provide supervision support, and also that all-important recognition, which we'll talk a bit about later at length. Okay. So what types of tasks can volunteers do? Well, the list, as you can see on the slide, is very comprehensive, and there's a million other things that we could add to it. So volunteers can really help you with anything that is appropriate and that your organisation needs. So the possibilities are varied, and having someone in a voluntary role can potentially be a fantastic asset for your organisation. And there are things on here that you might already be doing, but there are others that you might not have thought of. So one of the obvious ones possibly is maintenance and fundraising events, but they can also provide admin support, visitor engagement or management, and also help in times of disaster. So volunteers can be utilised in many different ways. Planning what volunteers can do, such as having a list of jobs, can be really valuable, so that when people are turning up or they're ready to go, you've actually got tasks already in mind that they can complete, and also will help you utilise that person's time well. There's nothing worse, I think, than a volunteer coming to your organisation and they're all ready to go and they've allocated half a day, and then there isn't really much for them to do because nobody really knows what tasks need doing. So having that sort of list of maybe some of those one-off jobs, but also some of those regular bits and pieces that somebody needs to do could be appropriate for a volunteer. So volunteering tasks should have oversight, coordination, and good communication. So the volunteer should have a clear understanding of what's expected of them, perhaps who is responsible. So that might be the volunteer coordinator, or it might be a staff member on the day, and also who they should be communicating with. If they don't understand the task, or if they're having some difficulty, or if they've finished early, they've got someone to go to, so they're not sort of by themselves at the organisation. So this is where community members can have a really important role to play. Like with anything, a little bit of planning can go a long way, and we're going to explore some of the different types of volunteering that your organisation might utilise. You may already be doing some of them. So job analysis is something that you do when you're looking at, well, what tasks do we need done? How do we want them done? And why are they being done? So this can help really help inform your job description. So it's important to have a look at, pardon me, those tasks that you know need doing, and how you might approach them and how they might inform the next step, which is creating that job description. So it might just be about creating a list of odd jobs or things that have been put off for some time, staff can't do that, or simply just there's not enough resources, so a volunteer could undertake those tasks. So once you've worked out what tasks need to be done and how, the next step is to build that job description. Again, that might be someone that is, the person running the job description might be your coordinator, but it doesn't have to be. You might have a human resource person or manager at the organisation that might take responsibility for this. But a well-crafted position description can be a big help in attracting new volunteers, because it's making it really clear to them what's expected of them and what sort of skills they need to have in order to undertake those duties. So it should be covering things like experience, what skills are required, who the supervisor will be, the duration of the position. So it could be ongoing, but you might specify how many hours a week that generally is expected of that role. And that might vary and might be tailored depending on the time of year. There might be an event coming up where you might actually have a specific role for a volunteer coordinating parts of that event. So the position description should also include an overview of activities and purpose of the organisation, because that's what's connecting that volunteer to you, to who you are and what you're about. So you really want that human connection element to the volunteer, not just to come and do work, but also to connect them to the purpose of your organisation. And where possible, their preferences should be considered. Not always possible to accommodate everything, but certainly you should be at least asking a volunteer what their preferences are in terms of times and days that they are available. The point is, I guess, we're trying to make here is that paid staff and volunteers have some similar requirements in terms of job descriptions, clear guidance, training and induction, which we'll get to in a moment. There's a little bit of information there about what to include as well. I won't go through that again. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how you might prepare your organisation for volunteering and what tasks your volunteer might do and what you should include in a job description. So now we're going to take a look at how we're going to get people in the door. So we've got the role, we've identified the tasks, how are we going to get people to come and volunteer for us? So some of you may already have really strong connections with your local community and existing pool of partnerships. So you're across all of this stuff, but always worth finding out just in case whether there's other opportunities. So we're going to cover briefly a bit of background about volunteering and show you how you might use this information to attract new volunteers to your organisation through the recruitment process. So we're going to look a little bit at information about who's most likely to volunteer. So that might help you target who you're recruiting, where they like to volunteer and how they like to volunteer and why they want to volunteer. So understanding this and making that connection pardon me, with what your organisation can offer can really help you in the recruitment process. So we did talk about declining volunteering earlier, which is a bit doom and gloom, but there is some good news. So while there has been a decline and there's been the impact of the pandemic, heaps of people are still interested in volunteering and they're doing it still in huge numbers. So yes, there's been a decline, but the overall numbers are still amazing. So according to a report titled Key Volunteering Statistics published in 2021 by Volunteering Australia, it's estimated nearly 6 million people are engaged in volunteering annually. So that is a huge number of people. So when you add it all up, volunteering contributes a staggering amount to the economy and in community life in Australia. So it's a really important part. And I think as we get progressively further away from this critical pandemic time, those numbers are going to start picking up again. I think the numbers speak partly to the fact that people love to contribute and they like to be connected to their community in meaningful ways. And I'm sure people are feeling that more acutely after the last couple of years and the challenges that people have faced. So who does volunteer? So there's a link there to some statistics, but I'm going to cover some of them off tonight. So the group most likely to volunteer are adults between the ages of 40 and 54 and the age group between 55 and 69. So there's still a great spread of volunteers, 15 and up. So it's not to say no one under 40 is volunteering, although those volunteering in the other age categories, there's a correlation between the ages of 40, 54, where there's a strong percentage of those who are parents participating and volunteering in sports that their children are involved in. So I guess it's not surprising the average contribution is for people over 65, presumably on the basis that those people may have retired or are transitioning to retirement and may have more time to contribute. But and they're looking for ways to give back and stay connected to their community. And this group can be a strong volunteer presence. And it's one of those things that, in some cases there are people who who are desperate to volunteer and there's more than one person interested in the job ad. So that may be the case for your organisation, depending on, I guess, what the task is, and depending on, I guess, the prestige of that particular role. So that's something to think about as well. So it's interesting to look at the sectors and the people that are most keen on volunteering, as we will in the next slide. So based on 2019 data, men and women now volunteer at similar rates. So 30%, 30.7% and 28.5% respectively, men and women. And women are more likely to have volunteered for more than 10 years, 43% of female volunteers compared to 32.9% who had volunteered for more than 10 years. So it's quite a significant difference there. And people aged between 40 and 54 years are more likely to volunteer, as we've mentioned, than other age groups. So we know there's still quite a broad spectrum of ages and reasons that people volunteer, but there is some particular areas where you might see a greater take-up of volunteering than others. Now, there is a link on this slide to watch a video, but I'm not going to show it to you tonight. I'm going to let you go and watch that at your leisure, just given the time that we have allocated to this particular session. But online volunteering is part of, I guess, this brave new volunteering world that we are in now, post-pandemic, and even was a trend that was heading towards that way pre-pandemic as well. So definitely worth having a look at, and it's a very snazzy little video, but also something to think about online volunteering, which is obviously not going to be about maintaining your property or garden, but could be looking at other areas like some of your administration, perhaps some of your web, if you're designing a website, that sort of stuff can be done online. So where do you find volunteers? So some of the basic, I guess, tried and true measures are still there and still really valuable. So local networks and whatever is more commonly used in your area is going to be the best place to start attracting volunteers. So sometimes it is as simple as community notice boards. People do still use those, maybe not as much as they once did. It might still be an ad in a local paper, but it also means looking at beyond those networks. So you've got the social media pages that you know people are looking at, and there's also ways you can advertise for volunteers, and there's a couple of links on the page as well. So many volunteers actually do start volunteering because they've come along with a friend, or their friend has perhaps dragged them along to a first session, and this is actually one of the ways that they then find that connection and perhaps find their feet. They don't have the confidence to do it themselves on their own, but they bring a friend along and they become connected to that organisation. So it's really important, if you've got any marketing material, to give copies of that to your existing volunteers so that they can recruit their friends and their family, but also people that come to your organisation and use your services. So they're people that are already there, they're already connected to you, they already care about what you do. So how do you get them more involved or get their family members involved? If you have social media channels that you use, absolutely use these. Sometimes the trend with social media hits are not particularly friendly, and you may not get thousands of people looking at your Facebook page, but it can be a place where you can send people to, where you can actually put information about what your volunteering positions are, and you can send that link to people if you don't have a website, for example. So a few more links here on the page about how to get the word out. So of course, social media, even more relevant now than ever, when particularly during the last couple of years where people have been online more than ever and having to connect online. So there's certainly many different diverse opportunities for you to get the message out. So you want to have a look at some of those. So there's Good Company. Volley is the one I mentioned earlier that has the really snazzy YouTube video. Is purely online volunteering. The Bee Collective, Go Volunteer, and Seek and Community are there places where you can advertise volunteer roles. And one of the benefits of using one of these particular sites is that people are already there looking for volunteering opportunities. So they're a captive audience and you just need to convince them to come and work for your organisation. And one of the benefits of having online volunteering is geography is not an issue. So someone can be living in Melbourne and work for a community organisation in Dysart, helping them build their website. So I think that's something that's one of the wonderful things about online volunteering opportunities is that the borders and the challenges with distance are not going to be a problem. Now, thinking about volunteer groups. At this point of recruitment, we've kind of focused on individuals and individual roles and job descriptions. And as you've touched on, many volunteers, you already have volunteers on board through your local partnerships, but this is sort of thinking about looking beyond that as well. There are other groups out there that may be interested in volunteering for your organisation that you might want to target. So looking beyond just getting one or two people, but actually getting a whole group, helping you with perhaps a particular activity that's coming up or an event, and you need more than just sort of the ad hoc or a couple of hours a week. You actually need a concerted and larger effort, so a larger group of people. Perhaps you get them on board to also recruit further volunteers, which is, as I mentioned earlier, often people will volunteer because they have a friend that does so, and that person then kind of brings them into the fold, which is really lovely. Sometimes there's local groups like Rotary, Lions Club, Scouts, Girl Guides that are looking for ways that they can support the community. It's part of their ethos and they want to be able to give back in that way. And they've got groups of individuals who are happy to contribute. So that's an opportunity you could look at. I understand there is a Lions Club in Dysart. So if that is a group that you're connected with already, that's amazing. If you haven't, perhaps it's time to reach out and see how you might partner together on an event or something that's, I guess, of mutual benefit. Now, volunteer sign up. This is just a couple of sign up websites that you can use where people can sign up to be volunteers. Worth having a look at. So they're free. There's no ads, there's no spam. They're by volunteers, for volunteers, and they're mobile friendly too, which is really good. They let volunteer coordinators quickly set up a free sign-up sheet for volunteer events. So like I said earlier, if you've got a group of volunteers coming to help you out with an event, this is a way you can register everyone, going back to that compliance and insurance we spoke about in the first few slides. So this is a way of registering and having everybody's information at hand and keeping it up to date, because the volunteer themselves is completing information. So just again, something to think about in managing your volunteer relationships. So we've established that volunteers are wonderful and you need them, but it's also worth flipping the question on, well, why do they need you? Why should someone give their time to your organisation? It's no longer just I guess it's not about being selfish, but people want to know, if I'm going to give up my time, why am I going to come to your organisation? What's in it for me? And obviously we're not talking about money, we're talking about things that will connect them to your organisation. So things like making a difference, the person gets to use their skills for a good purpose, they get to meet others and connect with people in the community, they're working for a cause they believe in, and they're helping others. These are some of the reasons people might volunteer, but there's also things, so I'm just going to look to the right for a second. They're getting to add this to their resume. So it's an opportunity to build skills. Sometimes the training that can be offered to a volunteer can really help them in their professional life as well. So it's worth thinking about not just attracting people to say, hey, we're a great organisation, you should come and volunteer for us, but thinking deeper about, well, what's in it for them? Thinking like yourselves, well, why are you doing it? And think how you can transfer that to, I guess, a new tranche of recruits. Another thing that you could look at is corporate volunteering. And it's something that a lot of companies are getting into nowadays and have been for some years. Essentially, corporate volunteering, it's a one day a year or every 6 months, depending on the organisation, where they get groups together to go and volunteer for an organisation for a day. Sometimes it's just a day, sometimes it's actually more regular than that, or it might be for a task that takes a number of months. Some corporations are looking for ways to match their high-level business development skills with supporting a community organisation. So they might actually be looking at not just volunteering and pitching in an event for the day, but actually something like helping you with the strategic planning or accounting or setting up a website, as I mentioned earlier. So perhaps looking at local companies and beyond. So not just thinking about Dysart, but communities around Dysart, even Mackay, where companies are looking to support their employees in this way, and everyone sort of benefits in that sense. The employees get to feel good, they get to have a day at the office, and the company obviously gets to say that they've done something good for their community. So you could also be looking at BHP and other big companies in the area who will have a commitment to their communities that they're operating in. So it's a way, I guess, of finding out where the alignment is between what you're seeking as an organisation and what their staff or the organisation can offer. Okay, so if specific skills are needed, it'd be good to try and identify particular groups. So we talked about the groups before, like the Probus and the Rotary, but there might be other groups that you might target if you need a particular thing done. So that might be industry associations, local businesses we've already talked about, but it also could be TAFE and university courses. Sometimes tradespeople and small businesses are happy to contribute some time if there is a cause that they're engaged with. Likewise, TAFE and university courses are often looking for practical ways to get their students involved in community activities. Just be aware that if it's something like an actual traineeship or internship, there can be some insurance and agreement implications that you need to look at before entering into those. But there are opportunities like that are out there, so they're worth thinking about as well. In these instances, as with all volunteer experiences, thinking about how you can best make the experience positive is going to lead to more sustained volunteering. So hopefully if they come for that one-off thing, they might actually stick around and become a regular volunteer at your organisation. Another area to think about is youth volunteering. So has your organisation worked with any youth organisations? We talked about the Scouts and Girl Guides earlier. There are other organisations out there, but this is something that's worth considering. There are lots of areas where youth volunteer programs want young people to have those experiences and have those opportunities to gain new skills and connect with their local community. So it's a really important community connection and benefit, obviously, not just for the young person, but for the organisation. But young people often find it difficult to get work experience, so these sometimes can be an opportunity for them to have that. Obviously, having appropriate supervision and training in place is going to be even more important because of their limited work experience. But thinking about how you can get young people interested in your organisation is another thing to consider. Work experience, I'm assuming it's year 10, but even looking at year 11 and 12 students, they're about to graduate from high school. They may be in a position where they've actually got the time, but they're not necessarily looking for paid employment, but they're looking at a way of gaining new skills to help them on their path to future employment and future studies as well. So definitely worth thinking about. Excuse me. Now in this next section, so we've talked about why people volunteer. We've talked about some of the changing face of volunteering. We've talked about setting up for volunteers and getting in place those basics like the job description. Now we're going to talk about, and we've talked about recruitment, of course. So now we're going to talk about what happens once you've got your volunteers. So we're going to look a little bit at induction, training, managing volunteer performance, and of course, all important recognition and acknowledgement of your volunteers. So you've found your volunteers, they're excited and they're ready to join you. So where do you start? So induction is something I've already mentioned a couple of times, but it's really important opportunity to get your volunteers settled in your organisation, but it's kind of that first impression thing as well. This is your moment for your volunteer to get their best, hopefully welcome, and their best first start at your organisation. And it's going to help in that long-term relationship. So During the induction, you want to have a clear outline of what you're wanting to achieve, so what you want the volunteer to do and how you can make the most of that relationship. So you're really wanting to have that underpin those first couple of sessions or first couple of weeks or months. So as with anyone joining your team, even as a paid employee or an unpaid employee, it's not just a case of set and forget. You're wanting to get that person involved at the start, but you're also wanting to check in with them at regular periods. So if you want your volunteers to make a contribution, you're going to need to give them those opportunities for training, but also to continue to develop their skills and, of course, be able to do the job properly, because that's what ultimately they want and ultimately what you need as well. Everyone benefits when it's clear what is expected of them. So it's important that they have that regular feedback. So you might actually put in place as a regular thing, you might have a meeting with the volunteer, or the coordinator might undertake this, or it could be, again, a staff member who's assigned that volunteer coordinator role. So when you're doing that induction, you're reducing the time it might take for that person to be productive, so that they're inducted properly, they know what's expected of them, they know where all the amenities are, they know where to find help, so they're feeling confident and they're really able to get the best out of them really early in the process. Induction should cover things like health and safety, absolutely, and being really clear of the expectations and also the limitations. So I want to be really clear with the volunteers where the limitations of their role is, so that it's clear to the staff as well what's the volunteer is able to do and allowed to do and capable of doing. So if the volunteer coordinator is not there on the day, staff members aren't asking the volunteer to do things that perhaps are out of their scope of their job description. So as outlined in the slide here, I'm just going to look to my right for a second. Having an induction that helps people be introduced to the environment, which is meeting everyone, all the colleagues, understanding the objectives of the organisation, familiarising themselves with the office, the environment, meeting everybody, finding out where the bathrooms are, those sorts of things. Getting them to review code of conduct or confidentiality policy, getting them to sign that if you have that in place, and just having an overview of any relevant risks. So around health and safety, there might be an induction video or something that you might show them as part of that process as well. So training. To ensure the best performance of volunteers at your organisation, training requirements should be considered. For example, from a risk management perspective, it may be necessary for certain workers to have certain types of training, depending on the tasks they're going to be undertaking. The organisation should also consider any high risk areas identified and whether that would be appropriate for a volunteer to undertake. So when assessing what training is required, it's best to start back again at that job description, looking at what will be required of the volunteer and letting that guide you. You're also looking at, identifying what gaps in the volunteer's skills are to make sure that they're skilled up in that area so they can feel confident and comfortable undertaking those duties. And training can be one of those things that actually attracts volunteers. So there are certainly organisations out there that I'm aware of that have really comprehensive training programs, and that's a real sell to volunteers because they know they're going to get this really comprehensive training, they're going to get lots of support, they're going to get mentoring, and that's not possible for every organisation to do, but it is, a point of difference for some organisations and something worth thinking about, because for some people, the volunteering is an opportunity to gain skills, and paying for some training or having some really low-cost training opportunities for them can actually be a real advantage. So managing performance. So we've talked about if we're correctly inducting everyone, hopefully everyone's out there, they're getting on with things, they're getting the right training. However, managing performance is something that needs to be ongoing. So it's not going to be something, again, that you're set and forget. If there are challenges, it's important that the expectations of the role are clear in advance. So again, going back to that job description, being really clear of what is expected of them is going to help in this situation. Having a plan in place so that they have regular opportunities to give feedback and to get feedback is really important as well. And when things go wrong, it can be really difficult to have those conversations. So if those regular feedback channels are already in place, it doesn't have to be an awkward conversation. It can just be something that's naturally coming up and you're checking in, and they might be identifying things that they're struggling with and you might have observed things yourself. So I guess the point we're trying to make here is just to have that regularity of that monitoring and to be aware. So to be regularly checking in with the volunteer or the volunteer coordinator or any staff that might be managing the volunteer's task, just to say, are they okay? How are they doing? And keep that regular, keep the communication channels open. Recognition matters, as the title of the slide says. It's one of those things that sometimes we get so used to people doing such an amazing job, we forget to say it, say thank you, or to recognise their good work. And it's really important because people do still want that even after many years, I'm sure. So a couple of issues that were highlighted in the Australian Centre for Philanthropy study actually relate to this issue of recognition acknowledgement. As you can see, nearly half of the volunteers said that being accepted and valued as a team member was the most important recognition that they required. On the other hand, only 10% of organisational respondents had given feedback in the last 3 months. So many volunteers are not getting regular feedback. They're not getting that recognition. So whether it's around, as I said in the slide earlier, around managing performance and maybe challenges and issues, or actually it's about saying thank you and you did an amazing job, having that regular feedback is really important. And as these further stats reflect, especially in dot point 2, somewhere along the line, organisations on the whole are missing the mark, unfortunately, with recognising efforts. And this is not a criticism. Things get so busy, people get really stuck in the operational, and it's naturally, things need to get done and everyone's really stretched, including volunteer coordinators or staff or committees. But what this study highlighted is that only 1 in 5 volunteers felt they're being recognised in the way that is important to them. And because we're talking about retention this evening, I think it's a really important thing to highlight, because if people don't feel they're being valued or recognised, then they're less likely to stick around, and they might actually stop volunteering, which would be terrible. If you're putting all this effort into helping them feel welcome, we want to make sure that's a sustained effort. So here are some of the suggestions just on the next couple of slides around how you might acknowledge your volunteers. You might want to look at things like arranging social events for volunteers, celebrations when projects are finished. We often go straight from one fabulous program or project implemented to the next, starting the next one, but it's really important to take a pause for your staff, but also for your volunteers who've contributed. Making an announcement at a group meeting or a staff meeting might be a way of recognising a volunteer. And again, it might be one of those things that seem very simple, but people do like it. They feel good when they hear that they've done a great job and that they're being publicly acknowledged in that way. You might mark anniversaries. So if you've got volunteers that have been with you for some years, there might be an anniversary that comes up. Their first might be really exciting, and then like a 5th anniversary. An organisation that I'm part of had someone open the building every day, turn on the kettle, get everything ready for 10 years. I mean, that's an incredible, 5 days a week, by the way, for 10 years, an incredible effort that was very much recognised by the organisation. But those milestones are really important to recognise if you can. We do get busy, but it's something that people are doing for free, and they're really taking up time that they could be doing other things, and instead they're coming to your organisation. So try and be immediate. When someone's done an amazing job, it's good to be able to give that feedback straight away, because that's the time when they're going to get the biggest effect and the biggest buzz. Be specific, pardon me, and be consistent. Recognise everyone's achievements, so obviously not just one particular person, but making sure you're recognising the efforts of all the volunteers. You might send letters. Next couple of slides, I've got some information that you might include in a thank you letter or an acknowledgement or a certificate of achievement. Those things do still hold currency. They sometimes seem overly simplistic, but people still do value them. We value that connection and that recognition, and that is one of the main reasons people are volunteering, for that connection. So to have it recognised, I think, is really important. So just here on the slide, You'll get a copy of these slides, so you can just copy and paste the text if you want to use it. But just some really simple information about obviously who you're writing the letter to, but thanking them, having the CEO sign it or the chair of the board, and personalise it. Make it a really nice, some actual examples of the work they have done to make it personalised for them. A certificate of appreciation is another way of recognising somebody. So similar to a thank you letter, but you're putting it in a different format. It's recognising it might be a particular length of service, or it might just be because they've done an amazing job on a particular task or a particular event that ran really smoothly. Again, you're getting someone like the chair or the CEO to sign it, and perhaps even present that at an event would be really lovely. It doesn't have to be a big fancy event with that costs lots of money to run, but a simple morning tea where you're presenting a certificate of appreciation would be amazing, I think, for a volunteer. Now, we talked in the first few slides about the rights of volunteers, and one of the things I did touch on was the right to be financially reimbursed for any out-of-pocket expenses. So, of course, volunteers don't generally receive any financial incentives or rewards for the work they do, but if there are expenses related to the work they're carrying out for your organisation, this should be reimbursed if it's deemed to be reasonable, acceptable and necessary. So we've got some examples on the slide there that you can see some of the things. So it could be like petrol money or travel costs. They're buying goods and they might be buying the milk. They're being reimbursed for that so that they are not out of pocket. Obviously, volunteers themselves sometimes want to support the organisation, and they're donating their time. They might want to donate money, and that's another story. That's another thing, rather. But if they're actually undertaking work for you that's then costing them money, then it's reasonable that they should expect to be reimbursed for those costs. There's also a link at the bottom of the slide with some useful information from our community website that you can use to maybe consider what should be reimbursed. Now, I'm just going to cover off just the last few minutes that we've got. I'm going to talk a little bit about the next couple of slides, just working with children and child safety, because it's something worth knowing. This does apply to volunteers as well as paid employees. So I'm going to cover that off before I'll give a last chance for any questions. I haven't seen any yet, but if there is any final questions, I'm happy to answer those. So children and young people in Queensland that are involved in childcare, schooling, health treatments, refuges, clubs, church groups, etc., obviously have adults that work with them in those situations, and most adults do an amazing job working with young people. However, there's always risks. So it's a responsibility of the committee to make sure that they are managing those risks, and being a child-safe organisation is part of that. So as stated on the slide here, if your organisation does interact with children, you have a legal obligation to identify any roles, and that could be including volunteer roles that are child-related work. Ensure that all employees or volunteers working in child-related work have a blue card in line with requirements, and that you keep a record of individuals' blue cards, numbers and expiry dates so that you can check those periodically. And there is some information on that very long link on the bottom of the slide that you can take a look at that can give you more information on the blue card requirements. And just another slide here, pardon me, on being a child-safe organisation. As mentioned previously, organisations that involve children in their work need to keep children safe in those environments, and having in place child-safe policies and practices is the best way to reduce risk. Of course, the blue card being one of them, but not the only thing that you would do. The Queensland Department of Children, Youth, Justice and Multicultural Affairs encourages organisations to use a range of responses to manage any potential risk, including meeting their legal obligations like the blue card, but they should be looking beyond that. And while a criminal record check is an important tool, as is the blue card, it's not the only tool that you can use. So implementing effective child-safe policies and practices is essential. It's one of those things I guess people find difficult to discuss and think about, or raise a concern with anyone that they might be working with, but it is an obligation under law. There's some information on the slide there if you did have any concerns, a number you can contact, and the regional intake team for the Children, Youth and Justice and Multicultural Affairs Department is also there. Okay. So we've come to the end of our session this evening on recruiting and retaining volunteers. I hope you found it valuable. Before I head off, I'm going to highlight we have 2 more sessions, 2 more 1-hour webinars coming up in the next few weeks. We've got one on Monday the 30th of May on budgeting, and we've got one Thursday the 2nd of June the same week on social media. I highly encourage you to attend those sessions. I would love to see you again. If you're able to come, please tell your colleagues and your fellow committee members to join us. We also have my colleague John coming up to Dysart for a face-to-face session on Saturday the 11th of June, which I encourage you all to attend also. I'm sure he would love to meet you. And just here is a page of some of the resources that I have referred to throughout the session this evening that you may want to look at your leisure. Lots of information to take in. I'm aware, hopefully you found it valuable. Any questions before we're a couple of minutes left for questions? If anyone has any final questions. No. I think we're going to just say a very sincere thank you for attending tonight's session. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. As always, invite you to give your feedback, please. You'll be receiving an email in the next couple of days with a survey to complete about this webinar. If you would like, I encourage you to fill that in, and please do give honest feedback. We learn from it. We'd like to know what information you would like to hear more about so that we can prepare for future webinars, and we look forward to having your company again. So thank you and goodbye.